I'm going to introduce Tadhg MacIntyre now from Go Green Roots at Maynooth University. So Tadhg, welcome, and if you want to share your slides.
Sure.
Thanks, Mel.
Just bear with me. I'm trying to use complex technology here, so just be a moment. Thanks.
No problem.
Okay, hopefully you can see me now, can you?
Can indeed. Yeah, perfect.
Look, it's my pleasure to contribute here today, and I think I probably add a different dimension, partly because of my background. So I'm an environmental psychologist at Maynooth University. So that's been the focus of my work, certainly for a number of years. Previously, I was a practitioner, psychologist in sport, physical activity and well-being. So essentially, I'm going to try focus on the human dimension, and I think it's really interesting. So a recent review suggested that although more than 50% of nature-based solutions projects have a goal or a target to enhance health and well-being, it's rarely measured, or at least rarely demonstrated in a clear and lucid way, which allows for the evidence base to grow. And I think the second point I'd mention is there's perhaps multiple modes of working with an NbS, and co-creation is very much part of it. And what we're focusing on is not just co-creation, but co-imagination. So we're very focused on trying to instill a shared conceptualization of the challenges, the processes, the solutions, and the sustainability. So hopefully this shall work. I'll just try to take it forward. Just one moment, sorry. Sorry, technology is winning at the moment. You're still able to see me on screen, are you?
No, you're back down to, you're stopped sharing your screen there.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Cool, that's no problem. There, you're back. We can see. Yeah, we can see you perfect.
Thanks.
Okay.
Great. Thanks so much. So I'm going to try use some natural metaphors to talk about, the project that I'm part of the team on, which is Go Green Roots. It's an 11.14 European project funded by Horizon. To be fair, just to give it context, this is essentially more than 6 years work to get to the stage that we're lucky enough to be funded. I'm now at Maynooth University, and as I mentioned, the title I have now is environmental psychologist. And I have to say, environmental psychologist is an interesting title because it's not a discipline which is prominent within the field of psychology, which tells you something about psychology as a field has to play catch up. So when we look at that point I made earlier about NbS, it's perhaps one of the reasons why, I guess, people's connection to nature, people's understanding of NbS, and their psychological ownership of a green infrastructure as part of NbS has yet to be clearly elucidated. So that's a lovely tree from Maynooth University campus, some of you may know. As far as I know, that is the Silken Thomas tree. That's just to give context to where I'm lucky enough to be at most of the time. If we look at the bigger picture with those mega trends, so you can either look at the report of the UN on these trends, or you can look at successive WEF World Risks report. These are some of the mega trends, and these are very much like at the foremost of our minds after being through the challenge of a global pandemic. So what's really interesting here is that some of these are very solvable, and some of these we have to question, did we really commit to doing much about them? And I can point out one thing here is that, we can ask a question, which has the greatest burden of disease? And that's often asked by people within different areas. And just for example, there's a lot of variability or I guess diversity even in one of these areas. So if you look at EPA recently highlighted that there's about 400,000 people die annually as a result of air pollution, and yet other estimates would be more than double that. So we have to question that there's different methods being applied. Mental illness is really interesting because in 2004, the WHO said that by 2030, depression alone would account for the greatest burden of disease, of non-communicable diseases typically. By 2017, they'd already come to that assertion. So some of these have accelerated far beyond what was predicted. The issue isn't a competition between the burdens, but actually to understand how they're linked. This is something, again, has emerged out of COVID lockdowns and obviously the challenge of COVID-19 global pandemic itself. So I think we now have a better appreciation these are interconnected. So just if to reflect back on COVID, and let's hope this is a looking back and we're not in further lockdowns. One of the things we noticed, and there is emerging research, the reason not presenting all the nerdier research is because we're conducting a review ourselves on this. So there's work by Geisha Kinderman at Galway in the Irish context. There's surveys both north and south in the island showing that people did move to nature during lockdowns. People explore their own local nature. And this is a major shift in behavior. It also has implications perhaps for active travel in the future because people got to know their 2 and 5K much better than before. So as a psychologist, I'd say their mental maps are a bit more sophisticated than they were. Potentially some of these promote long-term habits because hand washing isn't the only habit that we're going to have in the future. I think it's likely that some of these occurred for more than 50 days, and that's probably long enough to form a good and reliable habit. One of the issues was the displacement of physical activity with sport and gyms closed. Typically, people shifted their physical activity to green space and walking to the area rather than driving. So this is quite interesting because this has long-term implications for the provision of sport and physical activity and for Healthy Ireland campaigns, for example. So we're looking at this model of sustainable physical activity for the future. Just to give an example, last year during the pandemic, at the tail end of the spring last year, we ran a campaign with different stakeholders. It was called Nature Moves. It was based on the idea that, it's a low risk, positive impact intervention to get people to go to nature. And we had this notice active time in nature. So this acronym was actually behind different sequences or activities you can engage in during the duration of the campaign. The basis for this is a little bit founded by our work with some of these different stakeholders, Mental Health Ireland, and other projects we have with Coillte called Woodlands for Health. We did a review a couple of years ago. We certainly did the work on it a number of years ago, which showed that nature-based interventions, and that's different to solutions. So nature-based interventions are essentially applying nature as a setting for psychological recovery or stimulation. And that showed that there's a very low risk here. And you don't need to run a RCT on something when there's a low risk. What you need to do is to perhaps at most a controlled trial or more ecologically valid research. So this quasi-intervention did actually get a lot of traction on Twitter. It did become part of a national campaign for different bodies. And it gave us a hint that the views that people had towards nature were changing. And nature as a concept is quite complex. And I think that's something we're able to pick up from some of the subsequent research we've done on this. For example, at the moment, we actually have a survey across several European cities looking at people's needs for the future in their cities. how do they want to access nature? What types of nature would they like to see? And this fits in with the NbS principles around nature in our cities can have a huge impact on human health, not just on mitigating co-hazards of noise and air pollution, for example. So this takes us to, I guess, our specific project. Now it's really complex and I'm not going to take you through the layers of the cake, but I'll just hint that essentially we apply NbS and the nature-based solutions are decided on the basis of co-creation. So that means they're based on the challenges faced by the communities in the cities. And we have different dimensions of our project augment nature-based solutions. So they include nature-based enterprises, what we call GROW, FEEL, which is about sustainable physical activity, which has a really interesting point because it's not just about green space for movement, which has been the predominant focus for a number of decades, but actually green space for restoration, because some of the research we've done on during COVID lockdown suggests people were going to green space, not just for physical activity, but many were going there for solace, for tranquility, for psychological recovery. We also have a digital innovation component, which has some elements like virtual reality and digital nature. That's, looking at videos of nature on your phone. And we have a learning component, which includes engaged citizen science. And we think that's actually kind of central to activating citizens. And let me give an example. Engaged citizen science isn't what we might get from the typical paradigm of citizen science. Means you go to a website, you're told what to capture, and you go capture it, you upload your data, and you get commended as a good citizen. In engaged citizen science, which is a model largely based from the US in an EPA-funded study, was groundbreaking in this. And it shows that citizens can become not just data collectors, but engaged decision makers, providing they get to choose what the topic of the citizen science or the target is. And I think that allows communities to decide in their community whether they're looking at noise, air pollution, natural soundscape, particular aspects of biodiversity. So they get to choose. And that means they become part of a chain of decision making. And we think that's perhaps one innovative element within our project. So we work across 6 European cities. Now, this is not in a typical diagram. Like most of you would know the principles behind this, increased tree canopy cover and optimal species choice. And if you look at a city, one of our target cities at Limerick, it's got quite one of the lowest percentages of tree canopy cover of any city in Ireland. In fact, it also has essentially a barren desert in terms of green space. It's a major part of the city actually doesn't have parks, and the parks that are there have evolved and hopefully will be upgraded in terms of biodiversity in the future to offer more challenge. So there are essentially the use of connected green linear parks to promote biodiversity and provide green routes, which is obviously the name of the project. So that's essentially the principle behind it. But we have a different focus. So the primacy of most NbS projects has typically been to promote mitigation and adaptation. And in our project, our focus is not on the climate and species elements and biodiversity elements. The primary focus is on human health, in addition to other functions of NbS. And we look at this through a multidimensional model called 360 Health. So we're able to capture both through self-report and objective and other means, people's movement, where they're physically active. We're able to measure their sleep, quantity, quality, duration, etc. We're able to link that with sustainability, with their time in nature, with social community health and psychological resilience, which I'll come back to. So this is pretty radical. It's something we're still working on, but it will permeate all our project. So to be healthy won't be based on some of the narrower dimensions that we typically look at of citizens, which is either years lived with a disability or longevity. We'll try to look at health within a more holistic way, which should be able to connect sustainable practices and behaviors with positive aspects of psychological health. Just to go a step further, so ultimately we're concerned with promoting both human and environmental health. And I can just give you one example here. So really concerned with this idea of people's connection with nature. And this is something which is, being amplified during COVID times. We have several PhDs dedicated to this area, but one in particular, Maynooth, is concerned with what is urban nature. How do people perceive it? What are the aspects that are perceived positively? And this urban nature is being viewed as being distinctive to wilderness or some seascapes or more areas which are larger in scale. So urban nature, by definition, is typically going to, in practice, unfortunately, is often degraded, but by definition, often of small scale. And we're also looking at the ideas of using digital nature, both virtual reality and digital video and audio, which include things like soundscapes, simulations of being active in green or gray being built environments. We're using some participatory methodologies like soundscape walks, the walking methodology, Delphi studies. And all this is to really understand, how do we cultivate nature connectedness among citizens? How do we connect them to NbS? They recognize, that's not just new green infrastructure, that's their tree, their park, their space. So it's connected to what we call digital placemaking. Just in terms of, if we're talking about Galway, I think there's something that was mentioned earlier in terms of resilience. We too focus on resilience, but we're not just concerned with ecosystem resilience, we're concerned with psychological resilience. So I've been part of a research team working on measuring and understanding this. What's really interesting is natural environments really have the capacity to promote psychological resilience. So in a green playground, you've got much more challenge, you've much more gradated challenge, and something I'll come back to in a moment about blue exercise. So you promote this mastery motive, not an ego motive that you might get from sports settings. And people get a lot of choice about what behaviors they do in natural spaces, whether it's sit under a tree, read a book, or whether it's a green playground and you can try balance on a log. There's obviously some other benefits from fields in which I'm not involved, but we have members of our project who are, to understand skin microbiome in terms of exposure to different species when you're under 8 years of age, for example. So there's multiple benefits from some of these possibilities.
Just to give you 2 minutes there. Brilliant.
Sure, yeah.
Thanks.
Just to focus on something which is very, prescient for Galway. So Galway, as unique coastal situation, gives it access to blue space. And the understanding of blue space has really emerged from a European project called Blue Health and a project called SOPHY, which has Easky Britton, an NUI Galway researcher on it. And there's some other sources here, including our book from 2019 on this. Now, what's interesting here is this is where we can connect activity with policy. So our government has recently given, okay, it's a small amount, but it's significant nevertheless, 19 million to develop infrastructure to support water-based recreation in our blue spaces over the next number of years. And that's kind of interesting because they are following the evidence. The evidence suggests that blue space is very valuable to communities. And this can change our attitudes towards sustainability. So I'm just going to finish up with this slide to explain some of the big picture stuff. So COVID-19 opens a window into possibly a carbon neutral future. Certainly did for a time. Psychological resilience, equality, nature, and health. These are on habit formation, these potential habit of going to nature. These are all new possibilities for the future of urban citizens. All the problems I mentioned, talked about the mega trends. So these trends are actually all connected by UN SDGs. And I think if there's one learning we can take perhaps from here is that it's that we need to use and map out our activities on the basis of sustainable development goals. In particular, to our project, 11.7 is a target for sustainable communities and cities, and that focuses on providing equitable access to high quality green space. And what that usually means is, about 2 hectares within a 5 minutes walk of where you live. And that's something we can all work towards using nature-based solutions. Thank you.